Good morning. Due to the spread of the COVID-19 that we are faced with here in Korea, many people are restricted in terms of their travel and movement. But still, we are here today to talk about a very important topic. So I like to thank the organizers for putting together this important forum. So in this session, we are going to talk about the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation in the health and welfare sector from Sustainable Development Goals perspective. And in this session, we are going to invite two presentations, followed by 4 discussants. And the first presentation, we are going to have the first presentation, and then we are going to have a discussion on that. And then we're going to have a second presentation, and then discussion. And after that, we are going to have the overall Q&A session, including the questions that we receive from the online audience. So the first speaker is going to talk about the SDG perspective and the significance of the SDG. And regarding this presentation, Professor Ji-sun Lee from Gyeonggi University is going to deliver the presentation. And regarding this presentation, Professor Bomrero from Semyeong University is going to make a comment. And another discussant is Professor Chun-Heung Mo from Hanyang Peace Institute from Hanyang University. So 2 discussants for Professor Ji-sun Lee's presentation. And then we are going to move on to the second presentation. And let me introduce the second presenter and the designated discussant later on. And the first presentation, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be about the significance of SDGs for North Korea and North Korean economy, and particularly in terms of the socio-economic aspect. And the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, the reason why we are using this concept in the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation is that a few years back, the DPRK, or North Korea, and the UN, starting 2017 till 2021, the 2 parties, the DPRK and the UN, they agreed on the motto of sustainable development. So they agreed to pursue these goals. So that was quite a significant milestone. And on the SDGs, there are issues such as poverty and basic health care and welfare as well. So these are kind of the promises that the DPRK made to the international community, and the efforts are being made in this area, and also in terms of the inter-Korean cooperation and exchange. I think what kind of efforts we can make more specifically in the area of health and welfare. So the first speaker, the first presenter is Professor Ji-sun Lee.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Good morning. I am Ji-sun Lee from Gyeonggi University Center for International Development Cooperation. I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to speak, and also I would like to especially thank Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs for making this research possible. The topic of my talk
is socio-economic implication of Sustainable Development Goal to North Korea, focusing on the no poverty goal. Before I go into my presentation, I would like to mention that this research is currently an ongoing work. And I'm going to briefly talk about the research scope that I am covering and introduce what we are researching on. This is the agenda for my talk. I would like to briefly talk about the background of this research to stress the importance of this research. And I would also like to talk about some of the questions that we're throwing with the research and our approach. The background of this research is that we have the Millennium Development Goal, which led to the Sustainable Development Goal. Many actors participated in the process to talk about global development goal in socio-economic spheres. And the most comprehensive and the most frontlining goal is the no poverty goal. No poverty goal is somewhat different from the MDG. It is more detailed out, and it's multidimensional, and it covers comprehensive concept and definition of poverty. And it also looks into the poverty concept within the development, and it also looks into the poverty in a multidimensional way. So SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, has become more detailed and it has become more advanced. So this advanced and detailed approach is good, but the actual implementation puts us into a different level of challenges. Therefore, internalizing SDG and implementing SDG is resulting into different understanding in different countries and different geographies that is actually implementing SDG targets. And that's why we need more detailed research and discussion around the gap between actual implementation of SDG detailed targets. In that light, the research carried out by Kihasa would serve as a great basic research to understand this very problem. As I have mentioned, I did not participate in all of the research or end-to-end research process. I only participated in partial scope, and what I looked into was the socioeconomic implication of SDG for North Korea. I am not a major in social economy. I'm a development scholar. So by using the tool and background that I have, I wanted to understand socioeconomic implication of this topic. So before understanding how this is accepted by residents in North Korea, I also looked at how government is looking to this and how government is internalizing this and implementing this in the DPRK society. So when you look at SDG 1, no poverty definition exists, but I wanted to understand how DPRK understands and defines no poverty goal and how they're looking into it and their acceptance level of this concept. Generally speaking, emerging countries or developing countries, although there are many different targets under SDG, there are lack of data within the country. The reason for that is because government lacks their statistical capability, and there's also lack of investment into statistical research. And that also leads to some of the limitation in North Korean data. As I have mentioned, what I didn't mention in the beginning is that there's also exceptionality in political situation in the North Korea. That is something that's worth mentioning. And also, when you look at SDG 1, this no poverty role or goal is very different from other 16 SDG goals, because poverty is a very comprehensive goal and very comprehensive concept. So it's very difficult to capture granularity of this concept from data. So the internal situation of different developing country is very different in understanding the target and expressing this through data and gathering statistical background. So we need to really understand the situation that each of these developing country is facing. And what I want to therefore mention is that I want to cover what SDG 1 is composed of. And under SDG, there are different targets and different indexes or different indicators, and there's connection between the two. And when you look at target and indicator, we also want to understand how much data DPRK has. And so I'm going to provide some update on the recent data. And there's also indirect data we can leverage. So when you look at the poverty level in North Korea, what's their current situation? And when you look at SDG 1 target, what is the implication to North Korea by different target? And when you look at SDG 1, the large target or the goal is to end all types of poverty by 2030. And when you look into the details, there are 7 different types of target. It covers not only financial and monetary concept of poverty, but they also look at capability-based or human right-based target. So SDG target is a comprehensive target, and is these target being monitored carefully? And in order to monitor these targets, there are 14 indicators that has been proposed. And it's very difficult to see any developing country that is monitoring all 14 indicators. But through these indicators, we'll be able to understand how much poverty eradication is happening. And this is part of what international community is doing to fight poverty. When you look at SDG 1, it has many different targets, but the issue is that it's very aspirational and it covers different aspects of things. And when you define indicators, indicator only reflects selective areas, and that has been the limit. And when you select these indicators, those who recommend these indicators also had some political intervention. So it's not fully objective in its application. And when you look at these target and indicator, even if the linkage between target and indicators are good, the details within the country is very difficult to identify, and the different data access level exists across different countries. Having said that, when you look at North Korea's situation in SDG 1, what are the data level or data availability in this country is as follows. When you look at the international poverty line, which is target 1.1.1, this is the basic goal, but for North Korea, there is no official data released by the North Korean government when it comes to international poverty line. What international poverty line is that proportion of population living below the international poverty line aggregated by different population, and it measures people living on less than $1.9 a day. So there is a detailed target or detailed indicator that is defined, but it's not being monitored. So through different monitoring mechanism, we assume that the poverty proportion in North Korea would be around 40% to 60%. And SDG is highly centered around UN, and UN continuously monitors how these indicators are managed. But for North Korea, we are unable to monitor North Korean situation, so it is left blank. This means that, relatively speaking, North Korea, when it comes to SDG 1, there's extremely low level of data to understand SDG 1 situation. According to World Data Lab, people living in extreme poverty in North Korea is estimated to be 67% out of total population, and this kind of poverty situation can be compared to different African countries. So it's at par with different African countries that we have looked into. Then, if this is the situation, how will this change in the future? Will there be any progress in eradicating poverty in North Korea? In this area, it is very difficult for North Korea to extremely or radically eradicate poverty level. When you look at macroeconomic index in North Korea is facing many different challenges, and North Korea is sanctioned from international organizations. So there's limitation in import and export of goods in North Korea. So because of this macroeconomic situation, it's not going to contribute to eradicating poverty in the North Korea. North Korea as a country, before understanding the socioeconomic implication, let's try to look at what SDG 1 is in terms of socioeconomic implication. There's also criticism that the socioeconomic phenomena does not take place consecutively when it comes to poverty reduction. And there has been serious imbalance, and especially in Africa. So in Africa, the poverty eradication takes place rather extremely slowly, and it doesn't reflect the regional context and situation. And to talk about unilateral or one-way eradication of poverty with this predefined goal is rather challenging, is some of the views that we're seeing. And also, there's still lack of discussion on how we approach poverty eradication and the detailed strategy and actors in poverty reduction. And when you apply the same concept to North Korea lacks data, and it's very difficult to have access to data for North Korea, not to mention documenting and codifying these data. And as I've mentioned, this is not therefore included in the UN's official monitoring process because of lack of data. Then, when you look at the most recent data released by North Korea, and with that data, we try to analyze. This was announced in 2018, and UNICEF, jointly with North Korean Statistical Agency, announced this data. When you look at this data, they don't use the word poverty at all in this report. And all the concept that can reflect poverty is left out, but famine, welfare, and nutrition related data is partially disclosed under this report. And because they don't release any data related to poverty, it's very difficult for us to indirectly forecast the poverty level. But when you look at wealth index, they do release wealth index. And when you look at the bottom 20% of the wealth index, it can serve as a indirect database to look at the poverty level in North Korea. Even with this kind of disclosed data, we do not have data level that allows us to compare this data on an absolute level, or we do not have access to data that allow us to do an apple-to-apple comparison. So it seems that the acceptance of the poverty definition has not taken place to lead to this kind of analysis. Therefore, we need North Korean government to make effort to understand SDG goals and to reflect this within their administration. The reason I mentioned the limitation of what North Korea is doing in terms of statistical analysis and data collection is because when international community is ready to support and help North Korea, it will be important to have data available. So the current North Korean situation continue to have serious problem in lack of data, leading to SDG, which is a continuant from Millennium Development Goal era. Until now, data has focused on famine data, famine, nutrition, food. So it focused on part of the poverty-related area. But for us to have more in-depth or deep dive into poverty in North Korea, we need to have different incentive for North Korea to disclose poverty-related data. Thank you for listening.
예,
Thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you very much for observing your time limit. So thanks to that, we now have enough time for discussions as well. So I understand that earlier I was confused with Professor Lee's name, so I apologize. And now it's time for our two discussants to make a comment on this presentation. Feel free to stay seated or feel free to go up to the podium, either way. So first of all, Professor Bomne Lo. So, including for this presentation, do you have any comment?
굉장히 중요한
This research is very important in its nature, and this is not just about financial poverty level, but it also looks into multidimensional properties of poverty. And because of that, when you consider the situation in North Korea due to the lack of data, this research could be all the more challenging and important for us to understand. And what I want to comment is that I'm not raising issue of the paper itself, but I have some questions regarding the presentation. Two questions. First question is, when you look at data and indicators, I have some questions around these two. First, you mentioned and repeatedly said that it is very difficult to have data access. So whether it's poverty or inequality, it's very difficult to have statistics. But I think three things that are at work here. First, we need administration or statistical capability to extract these data. When you look at the Southeast Asian countries, they have challenges in having this data because of geographical remoteness. So that's why willingness of the government is most critical. Second is that we have COVID-19 situation going on at the moment. So how can we be transparent in disclosing this kind of data is also important. So these three aspects would be very important, and these are the key pillars when it comes to international monitoring. Having said that, when you look at North Korea needs to have some improvements because they obviously have some limitations. So what are some of the limitations and improvement that they need to have, and how can international community promote data availability? So how can we have better access to data? That's my first question. And second question is measuring poverty. As you have mentioned, when you look at poverty, poverty is multidimensional, as you have mentioned. So it's very difficult to measure poverty just with monetary index. Amartya Sen talked about multidimensional aspects of poverty, and I think it's an extension to that discussion. So based on your presentation, I'm sure the research considers all this multidimensional aspect. Nonetheless, as you mentioned, the monetary poverty or property will be still very important data points. So when you monitor poverty level in North Korea, what are some of the key aspects or key limitations in measuring North Korean poverty level with just monitoring poverty indicators? Because when you look at comparative indicators are somewhat distorted in times because of different situations in different markets or different geographies or different countries. So as an extension to what Matthias Sen said, even in a country that overcame this monetary poverty, there's still limitation in terms of society or economy, and that could be even more serious than monetary poverty in terms of absolute poverty level. So when you compare these different poverty level, there could be some difference that we need to keep in mind when we interpret this data. So what are some of the implications around that? So two questions there. Thank you for categorizing these discussion into part 1 and part 2, so I don't think I need to re-summarize this comment. Now we will move on to the second discussant, Professor Mo Chun-Hung from Hanyang Peace Institute. I am Mo Chung-Hun from Hanyang Peace Institute. Thank you for inviting me to this meaningful venue. This research, as Professor Lee mentioned, is an ongoing work. And with the presentation alone, I may not fully cover the full intention of the research itself. But when you look at the title of this presentation, the presentation title is Socio-Economic Implication of Sustainable Development Goal to North Korea. So the research is about how to apply SDG indicators to North Korea. I'm a scholar researching North Korea. And when I was asked to participate as a discussant, when I looked at this title, I looked at the word socio-economic implication to North Korea. And I tried to see or look at how North Korea is responding to SDG-1 goal and what they're doing about it. And I wanted to actually see that in the presentation. And my comment is as follows. As you have mentioned, developing countries have gap in terms of data availability and data access. There is a significant gap. And for North Korea, it's even more serious than any other developing countries. This is not merely SDG problem alone. Many North Korean scholars or scholars researching North Korea is facing this challenge. So, as Dr. Lee mentioned in her presentation, North Korean government, of course, lacks statistical capability, but there's also closeness of North Korean government. So they do try to not disclose these data. They're untransparent about data disclosure. And data classification allows them to be the extreme poverty country or low to mid-income country, depending on how you look at these data. And I made a presentation on welfare and medical care situation for North Korean women and children. And after that presentation, many North Korean escapee sent me an email complaining because many escapees agreed to what I said, but some said, "You didn't live in North Korea. And how can you define North Korea as a country that has serious medical and healthcare or welfare situation?" So this goes on to say that it's very difficult for us to define North Korea is in extreme poverty, and without really knowing or having access to these data, it's very difficult for us to assign North Korea to be in extreme poverty. So we're looking into different aspects, but in order to solve lack of data issue, we need willingness of the North Korean government, and without that, it will be very difficult to solve this issue. And as Dr. Lee mentioned toward the end of her presentation, we need a more flexible and open attitude toward North Korea. I fully agree to that, and I'm fully on board. But what we need to consider is that we need to overcome the lack of data issue. But in order to solve that issue, we shouldn't just merely look at how SDG is applied to North Korea, but we need to also understand North Korea's awareness and perception and their response to SDG. And the more North Korea participates in SDG, they have more incentives and more benefits. But still, they have not done that. So we need to understand the background of that. And I think those perception comes down to 5 things. When you look at North Korean media first, North Korea sometimes airs in their broadcasting station that they are following UN SDG agenda and they comply and try to implement SDG goals. But then this is just to promote these ideas. And second, they try to use this to improve the livings of North Korean people. And third, when you look at food, welfare, and hygiene, they try to link this SDG with these 3 areas. And also, Chairman Kim is trying to build a socially advanced country, and this theme is mentioned in line with that. And in January 2019, they had an editorial on welfare state of North Korea, and that was covered in that media. They also introduced some key topics around SDG through this media. And the 5th, I think, stands out. And North Korea do agree to SDG and SDG direction, but North Korea is very uncomfortable when international community pressures North Korea using SDG goal. So the 1st, 2nd, and 5th point can be in conflict, and we need to find the right compromise between these 3 points. If international community tries to pressure North Korea using SDG goal, and if North Korea feels that way, then North Korea will be ever more reactive in following SDG because no matter how big the incentive is, they will be reluctant to follow SDG. So we need to understand why North Korea is reactive in following and implementing SDG. And without fully understanding that, I think we will face limitation in SDG indicators. Data access. So I was able to learn a lot through Dr. Lee's presentation. Thank you for that wonderful presentation.
굉장히 짧은
Yes, despite the very short time frame, Professor No gave us a great summary of paper. So if I can summarize their comments. So the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, when we talk about the SDGs, the most important perspective is that unlike the past attitude that North Korea showed, now North Korea actually agreed with the international community on these goals. And as Professor Lo mentioned, of course, a kind of double standard, or in terms of who is really driving the SDGs. So regarding this, there are some discomfort that we sometimes feel from the DPRK, but still the DPRK itself understands the significance of the SDG in terms of its people's welfare. So we can feel this shift in attitude in terms of the DPRK's rhetoric, but still this change in attitude is a bit limited. And then SDG Goal 1, no poverty. Regarding this goal, how are we going to understand this? Our understanding is important, but what is the DPRK's understanding of this goal? That is also very important as well. So, of course, there are some limitations. For example, the DPRK authorities lack proper empowerment and capacity, but also there is a lack of willingness from the DPRK. So, for example, we don't have enough data or resources to get a clear understanding of the poverty situation in the DPRK. So, how are we going to perceive this? How are we going to interpret this? And also, under the socialist regime, the concept of poverty may not be the same as what we understand the poverty to be. For example, we define the poverty to be to live on less than $1.9. So we look at the poverty in a monetary sense. But this kind of understanding that we have about poverty might not be realistic for the poverty situation in the DPRK. So the poor people, the so-called poor people in the DPRK is as much as 60% of the population, depending on what kind of indicator you're looking at. And also, if you look at some other issues, for example, access to drinkable water, or if you look at the asset ownership, we can see different proportion of the poor population. So for all these issues, of course, the UN's perspective and our perspective on these issues are important, but North Korea's perception and understanding of these issues is also very important. And we sometimes feel frustrated about that. So this has been my own quick summary of your comments. So now, Professor Lee, can you answer these comments?
주시기 바랍니다.
네,
Thank you very much for that discussion. Key points were covered by our discussant, and during my research, I thought about our next step. And if there is a next round of research, I thought about how we can solve these problems. First, as you mentioned, data, administration's willingness and commitment, of course, is important. So those people who created SDG versus those who are implementing SDG has significant gap. So therefore, when you look at SDG has many different bars and metrics. And with these different indicators, it's very difficult for developing countries to fulfill these indicators. That's why I believe international communities need to go back and reflect on this. We shouldn't just apply certain yardstick to judge and evaluate developing countries because that alone faces some limitations. Another thing is that when you look at North Korean situation, North Korean's case is not very different from African countries because to begin with, there's lack of data. And when it comes to poverty, North Korean government is sensitive to data availability, and when it comes to food, they're very sensitive because it's directly linked to government's legitimacy. So the government is being protective. So that's why we need to devise different incentive to let them disclose more information. That is very challenging, but something that we need to start discussing. In that sense, although everything that we have talked about cannot be covered in this research, but I think this research serves as a basic research that can be a stepping stone in the future. So as our discussant mentioned, we have very important key points in the research, and we hope we can do a deep dive. And when North Korea really opens up and when they're open for more international support, we believe we can then provide more support based on data.
시간이
So the speaker and the discussants observed the time limit, so thank you very much. And so this concludes the first presentation and the discussions. And now we are going to have the second presentation. And at the end of our session, we're going to have a comprehensive discussion as well. So we are going to take questions from our online audience as well. So don't worry if you didn't have an opportunity to ask your question. And may I ask our second speaker and the designated discussants to come to the stage, please?
조은미 박사님. 정 박사님 어디 가셨어요?
Dr. John, do we have Dr. John here?
예, 그 연이어서
We will now start our second presentation and second discussion. The former presentation was on SDG goal and its implication regarding North Korea. So we looked at different implications for North Korea, and the second part of presentation is on the perspective of Sustainable Development Goal in light of inter-Korean exchange and cooperation in health and social welfare. So we try to understand the kind of exchange and cooperation we can do between North Korea and Korea. I would like to briefly introduce our presenter and our discussants. Next to me is Professor Song Chol-jung, and he is an Associate Research Fellow in Korea Institute of Health and Social Affairs, KIHASA. And next to him, we have Professor Min Ki-chae, Professor of Korea National University of Transportation. And next to him, we have Dr. Chung Eun-mi, a research fellow with Korea Institute of National Unification, KINU. With that, I would like to invite Professor Song to present his presentation, and we will carry out discussion afterwards.
네, 안녕하세요. 한국
Good morning. As introduced, I am Cheol-jong Song. So, at my institute, the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs, we study about the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation in the area of health and social affairs. We also work with North Korean defectors as well, and we also think about how we can pursue inter-Korean cooperation in the framework of SDGs. So my topic today is the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation in the health and welfare from the perspective of the SDGs. And we actually had more detailed research. So this presentation is going to be a quick summary of the findings of that research. Right now, we question whether the inter-Korean cooperation is going well or not. And North Korea is not extending any cooperative hand to South Korea. But still, I believe that from our perspective, we need to still prepare. We need to be prepared. And when the inter-Korean relations are not so good, like the present time, we need to think about what kind of small efforts we can make for inter-Korean cooperation. But because it's a small cooperation, rather than being intermittent, we need to make, even if it's small, we still need to make small efforts in the context of a continuous inter-Korean cooperation. So I think about two broad issues. One is sustainability of the North Korean society, and second is sustainability of the inter-Korean relations. So I look at inter-Korean exchange and cooperation from mid to long-term perspective. So this is the content of my presentation. So we've already listened to our first presentation. So SDGs, North Korea have accepted SDGs, and regarding SDGs, North Korea is making efforts. So I want to talk about the SDGs itself. So what kind of content are included in there, and what is the UN strategic framework for SDGs, and what is significance? And then I want to touch upon what kind of changes North Korea is making. And in conclusion, I want to talk about some potential for inter-Korean cooperation in terms of meeting the SDGs. So first of all, I want to talk about the sustainability development goals itself. But before that, there was MDG, Millennium Development Goals. MDG was also proposed by the UN. MDG was very much focused on poverty issues. So it made a departure from the aid-focused economic development. And MDG made a great progress, and MDG was very much focused on poverty, but that itself was a kind of limitation of MDGs. The font size is very small on my slide, but as I mentioned here, because MDGs were very much focused on poverty issues, it failed to induce social cohesion, and also environment and development issues were not comprehensively covered under the MDG. So, considering those issues, SDGs were created. And this is a comparative chart between MDGs and SDGs. So sustainability development goals are more comprehensive. So under MDG, there were 8 goals and 21 targets. But under SDGs, there are 17 goals and 169 targets. So much more comprehensive. And also, SDG pursues a more balanced development between economy, society, and environment. MDG put more focus on economic development itself. And also, universal principles are emphasized as well under the SDGs. So under MDGs, developing countries and least developed countries were more focused. But under the SDG, developed countries' participation was also included in the goals and more specific tasks. And the MDG was more geared towards ODA, and as in SDGs, corporate participation is also very important. And under the SDG, there is a reporting obligation as well. So according to the UN strategic framework, North Korea was supposed to report on the progress that they made under SDGs, but they haven't done that yet. So my institute is also waiting for that report from North Korea. So once we have that report, we will have a more detailed understanding of the situation in North Korea. So you have a list of the 17 SDGs, starting with goal number 1, no poverty, and goal number 2, zero hunger. But as you can see, many environmental goals are included as well, and peace issues as well, and global partnership is emphasized as well. So SDG is related with human rights as well. So if you look at the goals, number 1 through 6, these are actually basic human rights. And when you come to SDG goal 10 and 16, human rights are much more emphasized. So for these issues, North Korea agreed on the UN strategic framework with the UN. So the UN's action goal for North Korea is to improve the welfare of the vulnerable people in North Korea. So to improve the welfare of the vulnerable people in North Korea, the UN will support North Korean government's activities for this goal. So this will meet not just the short-term humanitarian needs, but for longer term, this is to empower the nation's capacity. And also SDG has 16 goals, 17 goals, and more targets as well. So regarding this, they signed an agreement with North Korea, and SDG is applied, and human rights aspect is an important aspect of this as well. And particularly for North Korea to be recognized as a normal country, North Korea made many efforts to improve on their human rights status. And within the scope of not impacting its current governing regime much, North Korea is making a lot of efforts to improve human rights situation and also to improve the vulnerable people's situation in North Korea. And also, if you look at the UN's role in North Korea, a lot of emphasis is on building and improving relations, and also international or global standards are being accepted by North Korea as well. And in terms of resource transfer and business execution, UN sets priorities for national development. So these are some specific contents of the UN strategic framework. So the SDG approach and human rights issue, gender equality, social development services, resilience, sustainability, data, and development management. So these are some priorities. And you can see the corresponding SDG numbers. And when you look at these top priorities, so you can see which SDGs are matched with which priority. As the previous speaker mentioned, when you study North Korea, the biggest challenge is insufficient data, and data is often very fragmented and intermittent, so it's very difficult to get comprehensive and systemic data about North Korea. But again, the overall goal is towards developing sustainable and resilient human resources. So again, these are some priorities of the specific contents of the goals. So food and nutrition security. So basically, to secure enough food for North Korean people and give them proper nutrition, and also to improve medical services, particularly for mothers and young children, and also provide drinking water as well, and also provide a quality education and education equality as well. So all these are included in the social development service. That will be priority number 2. And priority number 3, it's about sustainability and resilience. And priority 4, data development and management. So for researcher like myself, priority 4 is of a particular interest. So how these priorities are matched with SDG goals, you can refer to my earlier chart. And this is another chart where you can see the matching between priorities and SDGs. So after the action framework was agreed between the UN and North Korea, then what kind of changes have occurred so far? So now the assistance takes more characteristics of development. So that's one shift, that's one change. And also now we link the North Korea human rights issues with the development cooperation policy as well. And this is basically a roadmap for cooperation between North Korea and the UN, I believe. So this is basically a cooperation framework between North Korea and the UN. So from the SDGs perspective, the fact that North Korea agreed with the UN, I think the fact itself shows that North Korea has extended its hand to the international community. So officially, now North Korea is reaching out to the international community. So with that in mind, I think we need to think about how to cooperate with North Korea. And if I can summarize the goal again, and the SDGs and the human rights centered approach are adopted. So human development is important in this framework. And the SDG goal 16 is basically about the peace, justice, and so peace building and sustainable development, these are all pursued under SDGs. So human rights and development, they're inseparable from each other. So we can see that here as well. So the UN strategic framework proposes the peace and human rights as a condition for humanitarian assistance and development cooperation towards North Korea. And also, North Korea now agreed on this framework with the the UN as well. So this framework can be utilized for inter-Korean exchange and cooperation as well. Then what are some major tasks for inter-Korean cooperation from the SDG perspective? So I came up with 4 tasks. So North Korean government is now quite accepting the SDGs, and SDGs are pursued by the UN and agreed upon by all UN members. So North Korea now has the obligation to meet the SDGs as well. And so that will be the one significance. And the second significance is that the SDGs can be a compass to look at the mid to long-term progress in North Korea's social development and human rights improvement. And third, the UN framework can be a principle and also framework for inter-Korean exchange and cooperation as well. And fourth, for the SDG, universal exchange cooperation in the international society is the main principle. So we can take that for inter-Korean cooperation as well. And so the inter-Korean exchange, cooperation can take place within this UN strategic framework that North Korea agreed with the UN. So first, empowerment and capacity building and poverty issue and hunger issues and welfare and health issues can be pursued. So now I'm talking about the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation. So if we are to apply the SDGs to the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, we can see SDG number 2369 for the inter-Korean cooperation exchange. So I've made these two charts to show you some specific tasks for inter-Korean cooperation. First, in the area of health and nutrition. For example, we can help. We can provide baby formula for mothers who cannot nurse their babies. But just providing baby formula is not enough. For example, mothers need to have clean drinking water in order to use the baby formula. And also it means you need to have a heating system to heat the water and mix the water with the baby formula. So this issue encompasses drinking water provision and heating system provision as well. And also we need to provide medicines and some supplies for pregnant women and also mothers with young babies and young children as well. For example, diapers. And then also, if we provide diapers, how are they going to dispose of the used diapers later on? You cannot simply just tell them to incinerate the used diapers because it presupposes on the existence of the waste incineration plant. So it means that if you are going to provide diapers to North Korean mothers, you also need to make sure how it's going to be disposed later on. And some issues here are marked with asterisks. It means that they are priorities. So, for example, for pregnant women and young mothers, providing micronutrients prior to them giving birth to the babies, that is priority. And also for young children, providing vitamin A is priority, for example. And for women with a fertility age, for example, a priority task is to provide iron to teenage girls as well. So if you look at priority number 3 and 4, it is about health and welfare and drinking water as well. So these are some strategic strategies for priority issues. So strategy number 1, which is also priority number 1, is to prevent and control non-infectious disease. And priority number 2 or strategy is to reduce vulnerability and to reduce risks. So we need to improve the maternity and the children's health. And strategy 3 or priority 3 is to prevent and control infectious disease. So COVID-19 situation can fall under priority 3. And Chairman Kim Jong-un also emphasized on the control and prevention of COVID-19. So if both Koreas cooperate on this issue, then we can talk about infectious disease prevention and control issues. And next, welfare and public health issues are important as well. And here, industrial cooperation is going to be needed as well. And also the public's awareness of the issue is going to be important. And the human resources need to be improved and assured further. And also the aid provider it's not going to substitute the aid recipient government's capability. In other words, we need to empower the aid recipient country's capacity as well. So not just at the authority level, but at the community level as well, capacity needs to be built. And for the mid to long-term perspective, we need to bear that in mind. Capacity building is an important aspect for mid to long-term goal satisfaction. So this has been so far a brief summary of our research findings. But that research was from previous year, so I understand that the current reality is a bit different from that. But still, I believe this report has some implications for future inter-Korean cooperation as well. And again, North Korea has already agreed with the UN on the UN strategic action framework. So we can take that framework as a principal framework for inter-Korean cooperation as well. Thank you.
그
Thank you for that presentation. This presentation has a lot of details attached to it. So I believe using the presentation material to understand would be very much helpful. Since we are behind a time, I would like to invite Professor Min for discussion.
Hello, I am Ki Min, as introduced. So today's presentation is about the inter-Korean exchange cooperation in the area of health and welfare from the perspective of SDGs. I was able to see some areas where there is no change and also some areas where there was some changes. So for example, the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, there's no change. We still believe that inter-Korean exchange cooperation is important. And also regarding the welfare and health, we've been talking about some tasks for the past 20 years. So there was not much evidence that progress has made in this area. So that's something that hasn't changed. But the fact that we now have the UN action framework, that's a big change. So North Korea now has at least one agreement with the international community in this area. So I think this is a big change. I can think of three big characteristics or directions for inter-Korean cooperation. And also, I was able to think about some future tasks. So my comments will be about these. So in terms of the inter-Korean exchange cooperation, I think we can think about three principles. So acceptability and sustainability and autonomy. So acceptability means that we need to start from what North Korea wants. So a scholar, Nashimi Shira, mentioned that there is not just welfare capitalism, but there is also welfare socialism. So the advantage of welfare capitalism is that a lot is covered in the system, and also an adequate level of welfare services are provided. But the advantage of the welfare socialism is that the target is universal, and also the result can be more redistributed. In terms of the welfare development, we are talking about universality or inclusiveness. So, in terms of the welfare resources and capacity, the capitalist South Korea is much better positioned. But if we impose our kind of approach on North Korea may not accept that. So we need to wait for we need to let North Korea drive the agenda, starting from what they want. So I think that's important starting point for inter-Korean cooperation. And second is that sufficiency. So, for example, for South Korea, it is up to South Korea to kind of create a conducive environment for North Korea to take the initiative and to be self-sufficient. So, for example, there is a factory for equipment for disabled people. So in Belgium, there is a Handicap International, and they provided the infrastructure and also the disability equipment. It was made of wood in the past, but now it's made with a new material, polyethylene. So now the skilled workers, the workers are required to have some skills. So skills are being transferred, and the infrastructure is built, and the workers are trained to produce the disability equipment. So this is a good way to improve North Korean people's efficiency. And third, in terms of the nation's decision-making process, people's participation is important. So a comprehensive participation of North Korean people in the process of the government decision-making, it means that the people are centered. Now the center is on the people. In the past, it was decision-making process or humanitarian aid provision was more in the top-down style. But now we need to cooperate more with the local community, including the civil society organizations in South Korea as well. And we need to work with the multiple institutions in North Korea. And also, UN's report on the human rights of the disabled people. If you look at that report, North Korea also admits that they need to give more right to their people to participate in the politics. For example, the right to raise a complaint, the right to participate in the politics as well. So the key of the sustainability issues is people, and only when people participate in the process, real change can happen. Going forward, of course, we need to study further about various issues. And the first, if we limit the study or our future efforts to health and welfare issues only, then our future research will be limited. For example, some society and welfare aspects are very much dependent on the politics as well. And this is what we've seen in the past. And also, society and welfare, these can be easily used as a condition for economic development assistance as well. And also, sometimes in terms of the cooperation, medical health and social welfare can be overly emphasized compared to other areas as well. And second, SDG and a UN strategic framework. Between these two, there could be some discrepancy. And we were able to see some discrepancy in today's report as well. So when we see such discrepancy, what can we do? North Korea is a kind of unique country, but rather than emphasizing the uniqueness of North Korea, we need to understand that North Korea is one of many lesser developed countries in the world. And also, we need to think about the particularity of the inter-Korean relations. For example, we are ultimately pursuing the future unification of the two Koreas. So we need to bear that in mind. So sometimes we might need to be more aggressive in pursuing inter-Korean cooperation. And another point is that regarding the peace and welfare state, in South Korea, we tend to think about only South Korea. For example, if South Korea becomes more peaceful society, we will have a welfare state. But now we need to think about North Korea as well. We need to put North Korea in the equation as well. So how are we going to induce the development of more open economy in North Korea? So, for example, Small and Medium Businesses Association in Korea. So, for example, they need to think about how can North Korean people come to Korea and learn some skills in mid to long term, say 2 or 3 years, and then go back to North Korea and use their learned skills to build businesses and to develop North Korean economy. So we need to think about that. And of course, we need to overcome the issue of insufficient data as well. But in order to overcome that, we need to keep knocking on the door of North Korea. How are we going to do field investigation in North Korea? How are we going to take a population census in North Korea? Maybe for that, we need international cooperation. And also, we need to identify what are the real welfare needs North Korea has. And we can identify those needs based on the real evidence that we collect from the field. So we now have the UN SDGs and we have the UN strategic framework as well. And these are really new. We didn't have this before. Now we have these new international element in the inter-Korean cooperation as well. So I hope that we will be encouraged to be more progressive in this area, and I hope that South Korean government can take a more driving role in this area as well.
바로 정부도 토론.
So now I would like to ask Professor Han to talk about your discussion. My name is Eun-mi Chung with KINU. I am a researcher in North Korean studies. So as a researcher in North Korean studies, I would like to talk about practical aspects of North Korean research. When you look at UN's strategic goal and SDG, it has been the model for when you look at the model for North Korean support, of course, it cannot be in full sync with South Korea or ROK's support for North Korea or aid to North Korea. When you look at overall international community, as a member of international community, of course, Korea needs to be in line with international community's role. But when it comes to the actual implementation, we cannot trap ourselves into the framework or the scope that is defined by the international community, because that will limit us in terms of the kind of support and cooperation we will provide to the North Korea. So we need to be proactive in solving the problem that North Korea is facing. So when it comes to implementation, I think we need our own principle or our own roadmap and build that on our own for implementation. The North Korean project by UN, as mentioned in the preamble, it's not a simple support or provisioning of goods, but it's also about transfer of know-hows and expertise of the international communities. It is stated that way, but when it comes to inter-Korean exchange, and if North Korea made an agreement with the international community, we briefly talked about acceptance by the North Korea. So when it comes to international community, there's no resistance when it comes to acceptance part. But when it comes to inter-Korean exchange, there are some reluctance and lack of expertise, lack of acceptance. So there is a definitely difference between international communities' exchange versus South Korea's exchange or support to North Korea. When you look at North Korean and North Korean residents, we need to focus more on the actual lives of North Korean residents. There is international sanction, and of course, the sanction on military sanction as well as other sanction is prolonged. And as these sanctions are applied in long term, the most painful or the ones that had suffered the most is the North Korean residents. And this suffering is formed in a way that when you look at North Korea, they are a socialist state in terms of their political system. But when you look at their day-to-day life, they live as a capitalist society. So, for example, they have markets in place. What we're talking about in health and social welfare, we talk about food, water, and health and welfare. But all these areas for North Korean residents is solved through market or market mechanism. But with prolonged sanction, their disposable income is going down. And what this means is that they try to source their needs, or they try to source the product that they need in terms of health and welfare through these markets, but now these markets are limited because of sanctions, so they have lack of access to welfare and health goods. When we look at North Korea, the index we look at is the food price index in the market. When you look at their food price index, it was stable in the last 5 years. And people think that the situation in North Korea is not so bad because the index is stable. But when you look at North Korea, and I was involved in a survey that conducts interviews of North Korean escapees. But when you delve into the fact that their food index is stable, it means that their production has not changed. So production is stable, but disposable income of the residents is going down. It's actually lower. So people who want to buy these food is going down. That's why the price is maintained. But those who buy these food on the market used to buy this food more. So they used to buy, for instance, 20 kilograms of rice. And because their disposable income is going down or has gone down due to international sanction, what happens is that their income is low and they can now only buy 10 kilograms instead of 20 kilograms. So instead, they buy more corn or they buy different alternatives like wheat. And because they have less income, their nutrition is becoming poorer. So this is the situation. And in such situation, the inter-Korean exchange needs to be changed. And we need to change paradigm. Now, today's topic is on health and welfare, but I think this topic touches the lives of broad range of North Korean people. If you look at UN's support for North Korea, it was humanitarian aid. Compared to what ROK was doing, international community support has trust built into it because it was a long-term activities. But for us, we try to, for instance, try to provide aid for the sake of providing aid and try to show what we're doing to build reputation. So our voice was actually large because it needed to be heard. But then was it something that North Korean residents really needed? Did it really contribute to improving North Korea's welfare and health? I don't know. Is it really effective? I have some doubts over that. UN for the last decades already built this trust with the North Korean residents, providing humanitarian aid. So when it comes to flood damages or COVID-19 situation, this is something that we can do through UN mechanism or UN instruments. Then where can we focus? I mean, SDG has 17 goals available, and 17 goals is not something that we can equally participate in. Then we need to prioritize across these 17 goals. So as Professor Min mentioned, he talked about acceptance by North Korea. But what does North Korea really need at this moment? And for North Korean residents, in order to improve their livelihood, what can we really do? What do they really need? So out of 17 SDG goals, and I think it's the same for Korea, I think we need number 8, which is good work and growth potential. So for North Korea, what would be called as great job? Many of the laborers work in plants.
사무직에 종사하는
So many office workers are not paid. They are not getting paid. They are not receiving rations. They are receiving almost no ration in North Korea. So most of the North Korean population, they need to have 2 jobs, one official job and another unofficial job. So then what's decent work that the SDG is talking about? So for example, so you have an office work, then that official job should be able to give you a living wage. I think it's the same situation for South Korea as well. And so North Korea, in terms of creating decent work, decent employment, what kind of contribution can the inter-Korean cooperation make? Recently, I had an opportunity to meet a North Korean escapee who used to live in a Kaesong area. So that person lived in Kaesong when Kaesong Industrial Complex was running well, and when the Kaesong Industrial Complex failed to run. So this person told me that when the industrial complex was running well, then the quality of lives of the people in Kaesong area went up. But after the industrial complex stopped operating properly, then the quality of the life of the residents in Kaesong suffered a lot. So the Kaesong residents are now in a lot of economic difficulties, and that area was quarantined because of the COVID-19 as well. So there was a lot of complaints among people there as well. So Chairman Kim Jong-un even instructed assurance of their daily life as well. So in terms of the inter-Korean cooperation, there could be many areas, but for the long term and also for the resilience and sustainable development of North Korea, I think we need to have a shift in perceiving the economic inter-Korean cooperation. So in the past, we've told ourselves that inter-Korean cooperation will benefit our economy as well. So if the cooperation doesn't give South Korea good economic benefit, it is not a good cooperation. That's the way we used to think about inter-Korean cooperation. But I think we need to depart from that kind of thinking from now on. So from inter-Korean economic cooperation, we need to put more focus on creating decent jobs in North Korea. So I think that is also in line with North Korea pursuing the SDGs with international community. So in the UN strategic framework as well, the preface says that the best long-term goal is to improve the resilience of North Korean residents. But often we misunderstand inter-Korean economic cooperation because we think that once we promote economic cooperation and North Korean people live well, we often think that, we might improve the resilience of the North Korean regime. So they might end up having nuclear weapons and they might want to use it against us. But no, I think we should stop thinking like that and we should think more about improving the resilience of North Korean people. So I think we need to have that kind of shift in our perception as well. I don't know how much more time I have. If you can wrap up your comment. So my key point is that the North Korean society is already moved a lot towards market system. So market system sustains the daily life of the North Korean residents to a large degree. And we need to remember that when we think about how to pursue inter-Korean cooperation as well. Thank you very much.
I know that you were not able to fully mention everything that you intended to say, but with that extensive talk, if I may summarize what you have mentioned, the inter-Korean exchange in health and welfare at this point in time was it was the point that you were talking about. The perception at the moment is that there is this exchange between or interchange between new and old. And you did mention about the list of the exchange, but when it comes to the list of the UN or international community, it was done in a humanitarian manner, and it has visible and also non-visible effect. And I'm sure these projects and programs have priorities. So acceptance, independence, and sustainability, or autonomy and sustainability, I believe, is the aspect that we need to look at in continuing these programs. And both of the discussants also mentioned that UN's stance on North Korean support and inter-Korean versus inter-Korean exchange is not always in sync. It could be different in terms of their position. So I guess there's a difference between consistency and exceptionality. So we do see some difference and some conflicting concept when it comes to this, because we are in armistice situation and there are neighboring state, and there was a war before that. And North Korea's influence on us is bigger than any other influence in the world. So the effort that UN is making in terms of sustainable development, is it still valid for Korea in terms of supporting North Korea? Is it something that is feasible for us or legitimate for us? And that's something that we need to think about. Dr. Jong mentioned when you look at the details of the programs toward North Korea, it's not merely about North Korea's political system or government system, but you also mentioned about the actual lives of North Korean residents. So it's a communist country with distribution system, but many of the North Korean residents actually source their food and buy their food off of their local markets. This alone shows that the actual systems and actual practice within the North Korean regime is very different from what we know. So there's a gap between what is known and the actual reality. So this is something that we really need to look into. So Professor Song's presentation was about listing these different kind of exchanges, and the two discussants talked about how we can carry out these exchanges to make it better. So as a moderator, I was able to moderate one presentation and two discussants. So as a moderator, I'm going to add some words to this discussion. And lastly, Dr. Song or Professor Song can close with his closing remark. So looking back, when you look at inter-Korean exchanges, a lot of the exchanges was based on providing support when there is flood damages or whenever there was disaster, such as flood. There was also some competition in terms of two different political systems. But when you look at the actual programs that was carried out on the ground, these programs started to be implemented in early 2000. It wasn't because of the internal problem of North Korea, but there was a malaria that broke out in the border area, and that was something that we need to remember. And with Mount Kumgang tourism going on, many of the Korean residents or South Korean residents started visiting North Korea. And with that kind of tourist exchange, there was the support for medical system because the tourists sometimes needed medical care, and that expanded into medical care for the local residents. And also that led to training of the medical caretakers or health carers, and that kickstarted cooperation in health and welfare area. And that was sometime in early 2000 and mid 2000. And then that led to infant and toddlers healthcare as well as women's healthcare aid. And as Dr. Song, Professor Song mentioned, when it comes to exchange that only benefits one side, will not be sustainable. It has to be win-win for both sides. So for that light, I have to be very careful in saying this, but because we're in an exceptional relationship, we need to really think about this relationship and prepare for this relationship. And with that, I would like to hand over the microphone to Dr. Song for closing.
예, 두 분
Yes, thank you very much for your comment. So, as I was conducting this research for the past few years, actually, I've received a lot of help from these two discussants. So, thank you very much. And also, I asked them to give me the future research topics. And yesterday, I received a lot of research topics for the future. So, thank you very much. So going forward, when I conduct my future research, I think I have some ideas about how to expand my future research. So I think their comments to my presentation was from that kind of perspective. And as the discussant mentioned, in terms of the inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, acceptability and sustainability and sufficiency, these are very important. But how are we going to perceive these concepts and how are we going to incorporate that into actual policy? I often think about these questions as well. I think you touched upon a lot about acceptability or acceptance. As I mentioned earlier, right now North Korea is not asking for any cooperation. So I'm not sure if this is a good time for South Korea to initiate cooperation efforts. So it will be great if North Korea will come out and say, this is what we need, help us out in these regards. But North Korea is not doing that. And also South Korea cannot reach out to North Korea at this moment. So then, given then, we can think about the U.S. strategic framework, where North Korea reached out to the international community. And regarding sustainability, so at the end of the day, people is the center of sustainability. So when we think about sustainability, we need to think about people. And for future research topics, I think I've received 4 major topics. So if I can address 2 of the 4 future research topics, universality and particularity. So I thought about universality and particularity, and also moderator mentioned that as well. Then how can we perceive universality and particularity in the context of North Korea? I've talked about this with other researchers as well, but I think we need to maintain a kind of a harmony between universality and particularity. Of course, North Korea is a very unique country, but when we are focused too much on the uniqueness of North Korea, sometimes we lose perspective. The UN SDGs is more from a universal perspective, and it deals with the overall issues faced by less developed countries and how we can help them to develop further. So we need to have a harmony between universality and particularity, even when we think about North Korea. Regarding the data issue, yes, so we are waiting for that report that I mentioned earlier. I'm not sure if they've taken population census, and if they haven't yet, when they're going to take that and when the report is going to come out. We are not sure at this point. But once we have the report, then we will have much better data, hopefully. And empirical study and practical tasks are now the more current trend for North Korea research. So definitely we can benefit from better quality data in the future. And also, the second discussion talked about more proactive and more progressive way of thinking and pursuing inter-Korean exchange. So I thought about how we can go about doing that. And the inter-Korean issues, who is sitting behind the wheel, who has more driving force. The inter-Korean exchange cooperation may be very different from the UN's assistance to North Korea or the cooperation between North Korea and UN. And I agree with that. So there can be some difference. And also, we need to put more focus on the actual life quality of North Korean residents. As you know, North Korea has a socialist political system, but at the same time, they have a certain level of a market system named 장마당. So personally, I'm very curious about what's the exact proportion that 장마당, the market system, takes up in North Korean residents' life. But definitely, this market system takes up significant portion. And the discussion mentioned about the declining disposable income of North Korean residents. So I guess we can guess that the health and welfare situation faced by North Korean people deteriorated probably due to the decline in disposable income. And actually, if you look at the price index coming from North Korea, it's been very stable. There has been some change because of the recent UN sanctions, but still the food price index coming out of North Korea has been very stable. So I actually question the index itself nowadays. But I think what I'm saying is that we need to think about the 장마당 factor, the market system factor as well. And acceptability, yes, we need to think about stability. And in that regard, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, we need to think about that when we pursue inter-Korean cooperation, because I think that issue has a more direct impact on North Korean people's daily life. And if we can expand our research, then perhaps we can look at the inter-Korean cooperation in welfare and economy as well, and how we can link these two sectors as well. And of course, the inter-Korean cooperation and the cooperation between UN and North Korea. How can we also strike a balance between the two? And what can be the unique things that inter-Korean cooperation can achieve separate from the UN framework? So thank you very much for your comments. And I will humbly ask for your future assistance for our future research as well. Yes, so we've been talking about this topic, and we've listened to 2 presentations and comments from 4 discussants. Still, the inter-Korean relations are quite stagnant at the moment, so it might sound premature to talk about inter-Korean cooperation, how we can cooperate for health and welfare. So this might be a bit premature topic, but you know, there's a saying that it's the darkest right before the dawnbreak. So I believe that we need to keep the ongoing discussion about cooperation, and we need to be prepared when the opportunity comes up again. So once again, thank you very much for your discussions. And also I want to thank our all 2 presenters and all 4 discussants as well.
또
I would also like to thank everyone who made this session possible. With this, we now like to close our session officially. Thank you. Thank you for your participation.